Please listen carefully.
Hello, Team Anaesthesia. Welcome to GasGasGas. This is the best anaesthetic science podcast for the FRCA primary exam. Our goal is to fill your brain with all this highly useful information. Now, you might be in the gym right now, commuting, or ironing your scrubs, and there's no judgment here. GasGasGas will prime your brain for the monsoon of knowledge you need to imbibe. But regardless, the revision is eventually going to end. But for now, expect facts, concepts, model answers, and the odd tangent. Now remember to check out the website, that's gasgasgas.uk. There are show notes there with all the detail, plus links to foundational reference papers and anything else useful I find for you guys. Anyway, buckle up, get ready for your mind to be bent into a new shape, and let's get on with the show. Hello everyone, welcome to the Good Friday episode of GasGasGas. I've been released from the intense rigours of baby caring duty for the next 45 minutes or so, which is a delight. I hope you have some decent plans for your Easter Sunday, and perhaps the following week you can catch up on all that paperwork that hasn't been happening, courtesy of Wes Streeting and Keir Starmer's incapacity to do politics good. But let's not overdo it, and let's think about the show. Today we're talking about Sugammadex. Now, when I was very much starting out, and even when I was a wee foundation doctor trying to venture forth into theatres to try and see what all this confusing stuff's about with drugs and knocking people unconscious, there was always, oh yes, and you could reverse this drug with Sugammadex, but you have to sign it out from the cupboard and trade an arm for it. So we're not generally allowed to use it. And that was when Sugammadex was really, really expensive. It used to be £106,093 per vial, which just so coincidentally is the number of listens GasGasGas has had since inception. We have broke 100,000 listens. I'm really proud of that achievement. I feel terribly bad for everyone who is listening and has to listen to my voice drone on about such anaesthetical things. But I'm very happy about that, and good stuff. Onward and upward. And I'm being facetious. I don't think it was £106,000 a vial. I'm sure the people selling it would have loved to achieve that. But nowadays, it's £3.40, in my trust, for a box of 10 200mg vials of Sugammadex. And it's being spaffed up the wall like that wallpaper Boris Johnson chucked on 10 Downing Street, courtesy of his wife, naturally. And that lord who paid for everything. Anyway, cheap as chips. Folks are definitely reaching for it more than glycopyrrolate neostigmine. And so it seems fitting to close out our paralysing agent episodes with the one new, cool, interesting and modern thing that's really happened in anaesthetic pharmacology for quite some time. So we're going to get into the meat of it, Sugammadex. It certainly did change the game for neuromuscular blockade. Previously, your only option for reversing a non-depolarising muscle relaxant was acetylcholinesterase inhibitors and neostigmine, and sometimes pyridostigmine were the ones that were picked. But it had some faults in that you couldn't just give someone rocuronium and then chuck some neostigmine at them and it would all get better, because it simply doesn't have the capacity to overwhelm the competitive nature of rocuronium at those concentrations of acetylcholine that it can muster. And naturally, neostigmine has side effects which have to be countered by anticholinergics, and anticholinergics have side effects themselves. So patients might feel a bit grottier, more post-op nausea and vomiting, maybe a tachycardia. It's not perfect, but it did the job when we wanted to get people over the hill. When they're almost fully returned to muscle strength, you would nudge them over with neostigmine, which meant that people were quite, it was quite bold to do a rocuronium RSI in someone with a difficult airway when you couldn't undo that problem. And that's where suxamethonium generally found its position. The other thing to note was suxamethonium wasn't without its problems. You know, it's got a honking side effect profile that you definitely should be able to barf out in an exam. And if you can't intubate, A, it's quite a long time before it wears off, really, and B, the more you muck around with the airway and try again and again, the less effective your intubating conditions become. And then you might end up in a situation where they're not quite paralysed, but a little bit paralysed. Might be thinking about trying to have some laryngospasm and you've got this difficult airway, and it all becomes a bit of a torrential disaster. But then Sugammadex rolled up its sleeves and it came into the ring. It sidesteps all these problems. And Sugammadex hoovers up rock uranium, unlike my Dyson V7, which is afraid of cat hair, it seems these days. It brought us into a world where you could reverse profound rock uranium paralysis really spectacularly fast with one whacking dose of a drug, turning those considerably anxiety-inducing situations of, well, we've got to use sucks because it needs to wear off, but we probably only have like 1.5 to 2 minutes of actual decent paralysis, so we best get it right. Otherwise, we'll have to give them extra succinylmethodium. Oh, this all could be quite messy. What should we do? 2, rock uranium, whereby you wait a minute, you've had a look-see, didn't go quite to plan, let's just have a rethink. And their neuromuscular blockade over that time has gotten deeper, acceptably so. And if you decide to bail out because you can't quite achieve what you want to achieve, boom, reversed. So, this episode will cover the pharmacology of Sugammadex, its physicochemical properties, we'll touch on mechanism of action, how you might go about dosing it, the kinetics, the side effect profile, and some little interesting foibles that have progressively come to light with it. And here's a question, courtesy of Teach Me Anaesthetics. Regards. Today's drug of choice, Sugammadex. So you have a 56-year-old patient with chronic kidney disease, stage 3, and they've undergone a laparoscopic abdominal hysterectomy. 50 milligrams of rock uranium was given on induction, and at the end of the case, there is a post-tetanic count of 2, and there is no train of 4 response. Which dose of Sugammadex is the most appropriate? 16 milligrams per kilo, 4 milligrams per kilo, 3 milligrams per kilo, 2 milligrams per kilo, or 1 milligram per kilo? Have a moment, have a think. It is, as you would have thought, option 2, 4 milligrams per kilo. The Teach Me Anaesthetic guys would want you to know that Sugammadex is a modified gamma-cyclodextrin that reverses aminosteroid neuromuscular blocking agents, such as rock uranium and vacuronium, by encapsulating this drug molecule in its lipophilic core, thereby reducing the free plasma concentration and promoting dissociation from the neuromuscular junction, resulting complexes eliminated via the kidneys. The appropriate dose of Sugammadex is determined by the depth of the neuromuscular blockade at the time of reversal. In this case, the absence of train of 4 twitches with a post-tetanic count of only 1 to 2 indicates deep blockade. This requires a 4 milligram per kilo dose to achieve reliable reversal. A lower dose of 2 milligrams per kilo is only suitable when there are at least some twitches on the train of 4, indicating moderate block. Now, although Sugammadex and its complex is renally secreted, this patient has moderate chronic kidney disease. No dose adjustment is required. However, caution is advised in more advanced renal impairment due to prolonged elimination of the complex. This does not alter the dosing required for effective reversal in this scenario. Naturally, they're a bit more succinct than me. Back to the show. So, Sugammadex. Su means sugar in the name. Gammadex, gamma, cyclodextrin. And its brand name is Bridion in the UK. And it's a modified gamma-cyclodextrin. Cyclodextrins are found in a number of places in industry, in food preservation and drug delivery. But they modified it and added 8 extra arms that change the shape slightly and make it quite a bit more fanciful for rock uranium. The reason why it's used in industry and drug delivery is because things that aren't very soluble in water can be delivered to watery places using a gamma-cyclodextrin as a vector. And some clever boffin thought, oh, what if we did this the other way round and mopped up something with it? First approved for use in the EU in 2008. I was born by then. And US FDA approval in 2015. So we're ahead of the curve, spending all that money. It is a clear, colourless solution for injection, coming in 100 milligrams per mil, and generally you get it in 200 milligram ampules and 400 milligram ampules. Now, I always do seem to remember that it always used to be in the cupboards at 400 when it was expensive, as if the manufacturers were like being a bit sneaky and being like, oh, you're not really allowed 200, are you? You've got to pay for 400. You have to store it below 30 degrees C. So, thank God theatres have air conditioning, because if it was on the ward in the summer, it wouldn't work anymore. It has a pH of 7.8. It's a little bit hyperosmolar compared to blood, 300 to 500 milliosmoles per kilo. And it is a chonking molecule, as you might expect, at 2,178 grams per mol. Hefty. Now, check out The Sugammadex molecule, you can either go on the show notes to do that, or you can just Google Sugammadex. And it's quite pretty in its carbon skeleton layout. In 3D form, it resembles a truncated cone or like a slightly stretched out donut, where it's got like a dominant ring area and then a slightly funnely bit that extends the space within which rock uranium can be tempted forth. The cavity is hydrophobic, i.e. lipophilic, and the exterior is hydrophilic. So the exterior bit loves to be in contact with water, the interior bit less so. And rock uranium, alongside VEC uranium, has 4 hydrophobic steroidal rings. Remember, aminosteroid, the steroid backbone of these drugs are a synthetic sex hormone. That's what they plonked the acetylcholine molecules onto, as far as I understand, to develop these non-depolarizing muscle relaxants. Sugammadex, its mechanism is to encapsulate the steroid portion of the aminosteroid part of the molecule, forming a water-soluble complex, because it would be a bit daft if rock uranium bound to it and then it became less soluble in the plasma. Presumably that would be harder work for the body to tidy up and require more metabolism. And it complexes at a 1-to-1 ratio, so 1 Sugammadex binds to 1 rock uranium. The negatively charged carboxyl groups bind to the positively charged nitrogen atoms on the aminosteroid. There are also some van der Waals bonding forces happening, and I think one paper mentioned a bit of witchcraft. So it thus binds tightly to rock uranium with negligible rates of dissociation. So once that rock uranium is snaffled up by the Sugammadex, it is quite unlikely to dissociate. How this leads to a reversal of paralysis is because you've altered the concentration gradient. Remember, rock uranium is normally dancing into that neuromuscular junction, messing with a nicotinic receptor, but then it might dissociate from that nicotinic receptor, float off for a bit, but then another rock uranium comes in, and because there's a greater quantity of rock uranium around than acetylcholine, it outcompetes the acetylcholine and keeps you paralysed. You end up with a neat and tidy equilibrium of rock uranium neuromuscular junction, rock uranium plasma, but naturally your liver is mopping up rock uranium slowly from the plasma normally, and you get a diminishing quantity of rock uranium in the neuromuscular junction over time. Sugammadex replaces the role of that slower liver metabolism by basically chomping it up, markedly increasing the gradient of rock uranium in plasma versus rock uranium in neuromuscular junction. It likes a nice equilibrium. More rock uranium moves out into the plasma to keep it even and tidy. But there's Sugammadex waiting in the dark corridors of your capillaries and continues to tidy it up as long as there is Sugammadex available. And that's why you see such a rapid offset. It's kind of like the reverse of an RSI dose of rock uranium, where you've filled that plasma with rock uranium and it all piles forth into the neuromuscular junction. So like a big Control-Z, Command-Z, undo button. And that's why its chief mechanism of action is near magical reversal of rock uranium paralysis. It is, the first time I gave it, I was just like, wow, that's amazing. They were floppy and now they're not. And if you were to be asked a question about what would be a near ideal drug in anaesthesia, the answer could be propofol, because it's very convenient, but actually Sugammadex is now probably the interesting winner in that question, because it achieves all those things beautifully. And what is its side effect profile? Barely anything. It is almost biologically inactive. And that's just great, isn't it? What can it do to people? So it does cause anaphylaxis. And there was a bit of a higher concern about the potential for Sugammadex to cause anaphylaxis around the time where it was starting to come off patent, and maybe slightly before, where in Japan they had noted that it seemed to cause quite a high frequency of anaphylaxis, 1 in 2,500, based on some research they've done there. It was subsequently picked up in Australia with a study that was perhaps a bit more robust, that suggested that no, it probably wasn't 1 in 2,500, but perhaps more near 1 in 25,000. So it can cause anaphylaxis. It probably happened once in one of the trusts in my area, and we'll go into a bit more detail on that towards the end of the show. The other problem is that it can fiddle around with the combined oral contraceptive pill and the progesterone-only pill. Remember, rock uranium vecuronium, pancuronium, have an aminosteroids. The steroid backbone is a synthetic analogue of progesterone, which it binds to the steroidal part. Therefore, it impairs the function of these oral contraceptives. And you do not want a patient saying, I got pregnant because you gave me Sugammadex, and now you owe me loads of money. Might happen, might have happened, I don't know. But tell the patient. Barrier precautions for 7 days. We're getting ahead of ourselves here, though, because it's just such a magical drug, we can get carried away here. The dosing. How do you dose Sugammadex? You need to use the train of 4, unless you are bailing out of Dodge, you've given your large dose of rocuronium, and it's all gone pear-shaped. In which case, you give 16 milligrams per kilo. And, say you've given your 1.2 milligram per kilo dose of rocuronium, you've mucked around for 3 whole minutes trying to get a tube in and thinking, this is going very wrong, the patient's now very blue. At 3 minutes, if you give 16 milligrams per kilo of rocuronium, it will take 1.5 minutes to fully reverse that patient. Now, just because you've fully reversed their paralysis doesn't mean you've fully reversed their interest in breathing, although you would presume if they were blue, they probably do have quite a high CO2. There's a degree of motivation there, but it's not a perfect drug here. You might think, give some naloxone as well, definitely give them a drive to breathe. You still may have some loss of airway tone with your dose of propofol. So it's not it'll all make it better drug, but with common sense and thought, you can probably undo most of what you've done to try and retrieve the situation at hand. I always think that if you are definitely in a precarious situation and it's on your mind that you may wish to reverse them, pre-calculate your dose, because 16 milligrams per kilo is quite a lot of Sugammadex. If you had a 75 kilo patient, you are drawing up 6 ampules of 200 milligram Sugammadex. You should just have them on the side as a pre-calculated, right, draw up those 6 ampules and give it quick. Or draw up one, squirt it in, draw up one, squirt it in, to try and make progress. Now, if we're back to, we're at the end of the case, patient's a bit paralysed, how much should I give? You have 2 choices here, 2 milligrams or 4 milligrams per kilo, although in reality, 200 milligrams of Sugammadex or 400 milligrams of Sugammadex. If you can see fade on your train of 4, so you've got 4 twitches and the first one is quite reasonable amplitude, but then it diminishes off and you can barely see the 4th one, then 2 milligrams per kilo will work. And remember, you see effect quite quickly, but it doesn't just immediately stop working, because we all know that kinetics of drugs are not linear. There are diminishing returns over time as you suck out smaller and smaller fractions of rocuronium from the neuromuscular junction. So in an ideal world, someone who's fairly paralysed, you should give the Sugammadex like 5 minutes to work probably, and that would be more than enough to see the maximal effect of that dose, I would have thought. If you are in a situation where you've not got enough twitches, do not fear. Do a post-tetanic count. Because remember, we can't move our arms and legs unless we've got 5% of our nicotinic receptors available, in which case you see a twitch. You'll see 3 to 4 twitches if you have between 25 and 35% of your receptors available. So we're just trying to really get patients down to having perhaps 40% of their receptors available to acetylcholine, and then you will see depolarization and muscle control. Even the deepest, darkest upsadaisy, I gave some rocuronium and then they started closing, what have I done? Moments can be recovered, but you should use the post-tetanic count to understand the level of paralysis in this deep plane of neuromuscular blockade, and that's where you do a tetanic stimulus and then a zap every second, and you count how many you see. And if you see more than 2, then you can use 4 milligrams per kilo of Sugammadex and make it all better. Now, if you are in this situation and you've done a bit of whoopsie-daisy and given a bit more paralysis than the boss might have done, it would be sensible to give the Sugammadex with the twitchy box still on, give it a few minutes, and then check their twitches again, and be sure that you have achieved adequate reversal in that situation. And remember, twitchy box hurts when you're awake, and if you've attached it to yourself and tested it on yourself, even at the lowest setting, it is a bit stimulating. So don't be twitching a patient who's got a MAC of 0.2. You might wake them up, and that's probably not the nicest thing you could do. Cool. So what's the other problem with Sugammadex reversal? Well, you can't use rocuronium again, can you? Not reliably for 24 hours. So if you find yourself in a spot of bother where you've pulled the tube and then your patient's going and turning blue and it's all going horribly wrong for some unexpected reason, you can't give rock to fix the problem. So you would need to dose them with atracurium or suxamethonium, both which will work. Anyhow, time for a brief mention about the sponsors of GasGasGas, Teach Me Anaesthetics. These guys are behind an excellent single best answer question resource. Firstly, I took the joyful, challenging, and intermittent bashing through their 1100 plus questions, which they have written for the FRCA primary exam. Now, I secretly loved it, and there are plenty of questions to test your knowledge. When I was studying for the FRCA primary, it did not exist, but there were other packages online. These cost a lot more, and they didn't really seem to reflect the content of the exam. Whilst doing them, I came across rehashed MRCP questions, which was not terribly inspiring and left me pretty cheesed off. Whereas these single best answer questions have been built from the ground up. They have not sniffed an MCQ in a past life. They are based on the anaesthetic science you need to know, and there are explainers with all the questions, so it builds your knowledge as you work through them. There is a multitude of ways you can study these questions. You could choose to do a random battle with 1100 plus questions, or split them into subject area. You can go back and redo the ones you've gotten wrong. It's very malleable. So if you've been thinking about which question resource you might want to get your hands on for the exam, you shouldn't really look any further than Teach Me Anaesthetics. If you reckon it's for you, all the links to Teach Me Anaesthetics from GasGasGas are affiliate links. So if you're signing up through one of those, you're helping to support GasGasGas. So if you think you're going to go for it, click a link with me. You know you want to. You'll not only be supporting your exam preparation, but you'll be supporting your 100% favourite Tell Your Nan Over Sunday Lunch podcast, which is of course GasGasGas. Now, interestingly, I've reminded you guys that we only need to get receptor occupancy down to like 60% rocuronium, 40% uroinositylcholine to see good muscle power. That means that your dose of atracurium actually goes quite a long way. You may even get them looking like they've had an RSI with atracurium because you've not got to go as far as that dose of atracurium you might have given at the start to achieve overwhelming receptor occupancy once again. And that's a bit of a gift if it all were to go unexpectedly tricksy. There could be an argument there for niche cases to be very careful in the amount of Sugammadex you give, instead of just being a bit lackadaisical and saying, just give them 400, whatever, if you were to expect extubation problems, because then it will be easier to regain control of the situation. Just a thought. That's very niche, and you probably don't need to think in that much detail. Kinetics of Sugammadex. Absorption. Well, I don't know. I couldn't find anything that would suggest that when you eat it, you absorb it. It has been used as a food preservative, etc. So it's probably safe to eat. And when I say it has, cyclodextrins have. Where else do you find cyclodextrins? Well, there's a variant of cyclodextrin in Febreze that does that clever thing they say where it sucks up the smell molecules and makes it all better. Does it irreversibly bind the smell molecules? Does that just mean that the smell molecules are still there but you can't smell them? And if that breaks down, the smell comes back? Who knows? This isn't an episode about Febreze. The volume of distribution of Sugammadex is 11 to 14 litres, and there's no plasma protein binding involved. Do you metabolize it? No, you hecking don't. Cracking. How do you get rid of it? It's renally cleared, so if you've given Sugammadex to someone who you've given rocuronium to who just so happens to have absolutely crocked kidneys, you probably can't give rocuronium to them for a really, really, really long time because they're just not going to pee it out. And in that situation, you just maybe need to think whether or not that is the best method of reversing the patient, and whether or not atracurium might have been a more sensible choice. Half-life is 1.8 hours. Clearance is 88 to 120 mils per minute. It's quite an easy drug to learn and remember because you can reliably say that, well, there's no metabolism, it's renally cleared because it's water-soluble, 11 to 14 litre volume of distribution, doesn't bind to proteins, cracking, very minimal side effect profile, causes anaphylaxis, careful with your oral contraceptives. They could ask you a bit more about the scienciness behind it. Possibly, maybe. It is probably going to be a very, very commonly used drug from now on. So they could rightly justify saying, well, if you're using it every day, you should understand it. Now, for a bit of interest, What else could Sugammadex bind to? So, studies have shown that if you make a comparison between Sugammadex's interest in rocuronium and compare it to other things, aldosterone, cortisone, and hydrocortisone are 120 times less interested in Sugammadex than rocuronium. But they do bind a little bit. And then interestingly, 400 to 700 times less. Atropine, verapamil, phentolamine, naloxone, and ketamine can be bound by Sugammadex, but in really quite pathetic fractions that are unlikely to be of any use. Remember, verapamil, that's a non-dihydropyridine calcium channel blocker, sometimes known as verapakil, depending on if you've accidentally given it alongside beta blockers. Phentolamine is an anti-hypertensive alpha blocker used in pheochromocytoma surgery, and we know what naloxone and ketamine is, and if not, you should just go and give yourself 30 lashes. What else does Sugammadex like? We know that actually it does take quite a fancy to a spot of circulating synthetic sex hormone, as the steroid and aminosteroid is a synthetic progesterone-like hormone. So if you give it to someone who is on the oral contraceptive pill or the progesterone-only pill, you have rendered that non-functional, and it needs to be treated like a missed pill day. Now, you could render the argument, well, generally we recommend that people aren't on the combined oral contraceptive pill if they're having elective surgery, if they've got increased risk of VTE, because it increases your risk of clots, etc., etc. But there'll be a subgroup of people who aren't at increased risk of VTE who certainly may well be on oral contraceptives. Barrier precautions for 7 days are recommended. But now we're going to get a bit better. So there are drugs that can displace rocuronium from Sugammadex. So I'm sure if you could give these drugs in a inordinately large dose, you could reverse the reversal. And flucloxacillin and fusidic acid, both antibiotics, can trigger this displacement. So I don't think you're going to reach for flucloxacillin as an emergency reverse the reversal rescue drug. But, be wary if you've decided to, if the surgeon's like, oh, you know what, actually, they just need some flucloxacillin, and you've just reversed them with Sugammadex, maybe suggest that you should wait a bit. I think the bit of paper I read said wait 15 minutes, so it's not really that much to write home about, is it? And it's important to bear in mind in this reverse the reversal madness that what you have done is taken the rocuronium and prevented it from getting to the neuromuscular junction. The same amount of rocuronium is inside the patient still. So if you were to somehow magically displace it, you would just return to the same amount of neuromuscular blockade that you had previously reversed. So, Sugammadex anaphylaxis. If only it didn't do this, it would certainly be one of the most perfect drugs ever created. So it does do it. Once upon a time we thought, oh gosh, it seems to do it quite a bit. Ooh. And now we are more of the opinion that it definitely does do it, but it's not quite so bad. So what is the issue with Sugammadex anaphylaxis? Well, one, anaphylaxis is bad for your health. A type 1 mediated IgE reaction involving degranulation of mast cells, where they start hosing out histamine, but also serotonin, bradykinin, and a bunch of other vasoactive substances. Why are you particularly unfortunate if you've given Sugammadex? Well, we know that sometimes you get instant anaphylaxis and sometimes it takes a few minutes. You've reversed your patient, it's merrily mopped up the rocuronium, and you've extubated them, and now you're wheeling yourself down the corridor, and the SATS probe goes bloop, 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 and that lovely waveform disappears, and you think, the SATS probe's probably fallen off, although if you have a trace that wanes as opposed to just disappears or looks funky, it might be that there's just no pulsatile flow in their finger anymore. The patient turns a very funny colour, and you're thinking, I've got to now take this one to recovery, or do I reverse back to my lovely anaesthetic room where the drug cupboards are open? Do you want to be dealing with an anaphylaxis in PACU if you could rather be dealing with it in theatre? Maybe. And obviously you've extubated the patient at this point, and you can't paralyse them with rocuronium again. You've got to pick a different drug, like succinylcholine or atracurium, one which can cause bronchospasm, malignant hypothermia, hyperkalemia, etc., etc., and the other one which certainly can cause histamine release. quite the pickle. So, in Japan, one of their studies noted that the rate of Sugammadex anaphylaxis could be as high as 1 in 2,500, although further studies have suggested maybe 1 in 20,000, and a pretty robust 2025 retrospective Australian multi-centre analysis where data was drawn from allergy centres. They note that there's a 1 in 23,934 incidents of Sugammadex anaphylaxis. And this was allergy centres deciding, yes, they do have a reaction to Sugammadex. More robust than, we gave lots of drugs, including Sugammadex, and there definitely was anaphylaxis. Clinically, did it seem to correlate with the Sugammadex, which is what some of the other studies have done. There are suggestions that the incidence may increase over time. We might see an increase over time as more and more people are exposed to Sugammadex multiple times. And the fact that cyclodextrins are found as food preservatives and drug carriers and in other bits and bobs and products where you might end up inadvertently being sensitized to one of the structures that just so happens to also be found in Sugammadex. But let's contextualize this, because no one likes anaphylaxis. There are other drugs we give that are far more likely to cause mischief. Teicoplanin is the most anaphylactogenic drug we routinely use, 1 in 6,500 incidents of anaphylaxis. Now, that was pulled from a paper, Sarvik et al., again referenced in the show notes. We give teicoplanin all the time. I know, hopefully now that we're all giving it quite hecking slowly as opposed to just boshing it in. I'm sure none of us really boshed it in, but when it's in a 20ml syringe, it's easy to give a bit too much at a time. Really, you should give 1 or 2 mils, muck around for a bit, 1 or 2 mils, muck around for a bit, or stick it in a bag. I'm not going to start talking about how teicoplanin causes mischief, but if you want to create an accidental syringe of something that looks like propofol, draw up teicoplanin and then draw up an ampule of gentamicin into it. I did it this week just to see just how precipitated it is, and in a flash, it turned white and looked like propofol in my 20ml syringe. I discarded that, and I was quite amazed at how rapidly it precipitated, and it definitely precipitates. I'd like to do the same with dexamethasone, actually, because when you're giving the teicoplanin, it gets blooming annoying, because you're like, there's teicoplanin in my heckin' IV line. I can't mix that, or I can't mix that. And routinely, I split my gentamicin dose. I give a bit, and then do some other stuff, and then I give the other bit as well. And it's just awkward. Anyway, getting ahead of myself, we will do teicoplanin in the future. Before we summarise and close up for today, can we use Sugammadex to reverse rocuronium anaphylaxis? And I think the jury is out, because there are certainly case studies which say, we had anaphylaxis to rocuronium, we gave Sugammadex, and everything got better. A number of these case studies say everything got better, everything got a little bit worse again, and we gave a bit more Sugammadex, and everything got better again, because you need to mop up all the molecule, otherwise there is molecule tickling mast cells. I've been in a situation with a rocuronium anaphylaxis where, it's not the first thing you reach for, Sugammadex. It took maybe 10, 15 minutes before we thought, shall we give it a go? It didn't really do anything. I think in part it could be that it wasn't the rocuronium, but I think later allergy testing demonstrated that it was. And in part, it's not just a singular pathological event, an anaphylaxis. It's not just, here's some histamine, off you go. Once the histamine's out of your plasma, it's all tickety-boo. The mast cells produce serotonin, bradykinin. These things trigger vasodilation, other endothelial changes that leads to a extensive process. If anyone else has treated anaphylaxis, you don't just give one bit of adrenaline and it all magically goes away. It peters out over time, and that patient ended up on ITU, on an adrenaline infusion, as their blood pressure lability slowly eased over like 6 to 8 hours. But other case studies have said, no, it didn't work, and therefore we are certainly on the fence. I think when we thought, well, there's a 1 in 2,500 chance of causing anaphylaxis with Sugammadex, I think people were rightly slightly cagier about it. I think, having read the truer incidents, I think I probably would just reach for some Sugammadex and see if you can make it all better. Presumably at that point, though, you do have the patient intubated, so you can control their breathing regardless. Anyway, so in summary, Sugammadex, Bridion, this is a modified gamma-cyclodextrin, one of the first selective relaxant binding agents. It works by encapsulating the steroidal ring structure of the aminosteroid neuromuscular blocking drug, holding it inside its hydrophobic cavity at a 1-to-1 ratio. This renders the rocuronium biologically inactive, creating a delightful concentration gradient between neuromuscular junction and plasma that draws rocuronium away from our nicotinic receptors on our muscle. If you can see fade with your train of 4, give them 2 milligrams per kilo. If you can't see fade but you have 1 to 2 post-tetanic twitches following tetany, give them 4 milligrams per kilo, and it's 16 milligrams per kilo for rescue reversal. Kinetics-wise, there is no protein binding, there is no metabolism, it's renally excreted, 1.8 hour half-life. Bar the anaphylaxis, its side effect profile is dreamy, but remember, oral contraceptives are an issue, and flucloxacillin has fabulous philandering abilities when it comes to tempting that rocuronium out of the clutches of Sugammadex. Don't try and reparalyse your patient with rocuronium if you've given them Sugammadex. You need to be reaching for atracurium or Sux. They are likely to work more quickly. Beautiful. So, thank you everyone for listening to this Good Friday episode on Sugammadex. I know we've been venturing off into the long grass with vecuronium and pancuronium, and I thought bringing it back to reality to close out our paralysing drugs chapter would just tide things over nicely. Take a moment to say thank you very much for listening. 100,000 plus listens, 2,000 plus direct followers. Never thought it would get this far. I just thought it'd be fun to do a podcast. So, thank you very much. Ahoy, Team Anaesthesia! You've survived yet another episode of Gas, Gas, Gas. Now, if you found it useful or harrowingly awful, please like and subscribe, drop us a star or 12, and follow with whichever podcast platform you find yourself using. Please leave a comment or ping off an email if you think I need to square something away. Now, there are a bunch of ways to support the costs of Gas, Gas, Gas. From buying me a coffee, to venturing forth via an affiliate link to the horde of joyful SBA questions from Teach Me Anaesthetics. Those links are on the website and in the show notes. Speaking of website, definitely check out GasGasGas.uk for the show notes, diagrams, details, the references. Now, we all know, guys, that this is a bucket of content to consume, and it is like drinking from a fire hose. So I want to finish by saying, take it day by day, don't overcook yourself, don't freak out, and keep studying.